In our last two videos, we've looked at things like forms and buttons. And now I want to incorporate both of those. Now, not just a button for saying like submit, but buttons that can be used to help improve the usability of our forms. Now you might think, how are we going to do that? Well, one way is to update the way that we handle checkboxes and radio buttons. Now, you can go through the documentation and see how to do a checkbox and radio button. That's pretty simple. But I want to create something known as a button group. A button group is simply going to allow us to group those together and have a big button to click on instead of a little checkbox or a little radio button. So let's see how we're going to do that. First with a regular set of buttons, and then using checkboxes and radio buttons. So over here, I have my row, I have my column, and I'm going to create a new div, class equals, and this is going to be button group, like you see there. And then inside of this, I'm simply going to put a couple buttons. Now I'm going to come over to a web browser, reload that, and you notice I see my buttons 1, 2, and 3. It looks like one big button, one big bar. Notice that instead of having 3 individual buttons, the spaces in between them have been removed, and only my outer buttons have the curves on the edges. The center button, or buttons, if I had more than 3, would be solid. If I hover over them, though, you notice that you can see the change and how they are individual buttons. So they are separate. In fact, I don't even have to have just that one color. I could have multiple colors. So I'm going to change this from button primary to button secondary and success, just so you see some different colors. Reload them, and you can see I can do kind of whatever I want to with that. Well, this is going to be important for a demonstration we're going to see in just a minute. Now, these buttons are your traditional buttons, and I would not recommend putting things like a submit and a reset right next to each other. I always like to give them space. That way you don't have someone accidentally click on something. But for things like a radio button where I want to choose from a small selection, this becomes very beneficial. So let's look at how we're going to do that for radio buttons. I'm going to create a new div for a new row. And then one for a new column. That way I'll have my button group on top. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to create a div. Class is once again going to be button-group. In this case, I'm going to choose a role, and this is going to be for a group. And this is important anytime you want to have any type of accessibility tools that are going to be used so people who are visually impaired will understand what's going on. So we're simply going to look at this and say something like, group of radio button examples. So pretty simple as far as that goes. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we have to have our input and our label. Okay, so in this case, we're going to say input type. And this type, we're going to use radio. So we're going to do our radio buttons first. Do a name. And just as a reminder with your forms, the element names have to be the same so that it knows what group to be in. So we're going to choose colors. The class is going to be btn-check, like you see there. And I'm going to set autocomplete to off. And then finally, I'm going to say ID equals, this is going to see radio blue. You'll see why in just a second. Now I'm going to have my label. And typically this is what we do, right? Typically we say label for radio blue, and that knows how it's attached to it. However, we are going to give a class. I'm simply going to say btn and then btn-primary. You'll see I have a blue button. You notice it's not really defined as having multiple radio buttons. It's kind of useless. But notice the little circle is gone. And so I have this whole big area that I can click on. In fact, because it's a button, it's bigger than I'd have if I just clicked on the label even. So this is a helpful thing. Let's come back here, and I'm going to just real quickly create some new options for my inputs and labels the exact same way I have this one. So notice I've kind of expanded this. I have blue, green, and red. They're all set up the same way. I have the input, then I have the label. I use the btn-check for my input type, and I use the 2 button classes you would expect for my buttons. Now, because I'm trying to make this really obvious, I'm using blue, green, and red, and so I have button primary, success, and danger. Now, obviously, if I'm using a different theme, those colors will be different, but for this simplicity's sake, it's working for me. Save this and go back to my browser, reload. You notice I have 3 buttons, blue, green, and red. If I click on it, you can see it's highlighted, and I can only click on one of that group. And so this makes it really easy to stand up like, hey, this is a group. They're attached. I can only select one. It's working just like a radio button, but it's a lot easier to use. Let's create one more column that's going to have the checkboxes that does the same type of thing. So here I have another div column, and inside that I'm going to have a div button group, role group, an ARIA label, as such. Okay, now setting up my checkboxes is going to be almost identical. So I need to set my input tag. So I'm going to say input type checkbox. ID is going to equal V1. I'm going to leave name off. It's not necessary for this example, so don't worry about that. I'm going to specify class btn-check, just like I did for radio buttons. And then I'm going to specify autocomplete to be off. Once that's done, I'm going to create an associated label. So I'm going to say label for V1, class, then I can create it for a button. Then I can create any type of button I want. I'm just going to use button primary for this, so btn-primary. And I give it a value that's going to be displayed in between it. Now, I can have something that's just this one. If I reload it, you see here, I can click on it. It stays active. I can uncheck it. It's inactive. But a button checkbox group of 1 is really good, so let's fix that up so we get more than 1. So you can see how I always keep my stuff grouped. I have this blank space in between just to make it a little bit easier to read for myself. Come back here, reload. Now I see all 3 values, and I can have multiple values from the group selected, because that's the way checkboxes work. Checkboxes are designed to have multiple values be able to be selected at a single time. So this is a really simple and easy way to kind of combine groups, make a bigger target, especially if I'm going to be using my finger because I'm on a mobile device. And I like that. Okay. I also see what elements are related. So for checkboxes, it might be great for ordering online where you have multiple options and they're not independent of one another, and you can simply check multiple ones. This makes it really, really easy. So look for something like this. It's a great little way. Now with the checkboxes and the radio buttons, you don't have to put them in a group. I like the radio buttons in a group. Checkboxes, sometimes I want them in a group, sometimes I want them separate. It just depends upon how many there are, what type of space I have, etc. So it's really dependent upon what is it that you're trying to do in that specific case. This is a great way. We have another form sample we're going to do where we kind of combine some different elements. We're going to take a look at that next, so stay tuned for that video. And if you didn't know, this is part of a larger series on Bootstrap, so you might want to take a look at the playlist that's up on your screen now.